Hello, greetings, welcome. Hi, everybody. Happy Sunday. Hope everybody is doing fantastic. And we certainly hope that you are achieving and maintaining your highest levels of mental, physical, and spiritual health to the highest degree possible. We sincerely hope that, and we are glad that you decided to join us today as we talk about the contributions of a critical person in human history, a person who for the most part is completely overlooked, and which is not uncommon for colonized people, African people, but this person in particular, even within that realm, is still constantly unknown and overlooked. So we wanted to talk today about some of Sekou Ture's many important contributions to Africa and to humanity. And we will start, as we always do, since we sit here in the Western Hemisphere on the Turtle Island, the land of the indigenous people, we always start by acknowledging that this land that we sit on, from Alaska all the way down to Chile, meaning North America, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, each and every square inch of it is the land of the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. And they must get their land back. They are fighting to get it back. They are not fighting for casinos or they're not fighting for money. They're not selling out their sacred connection to the land for a payment. And that's a message for these Africans who are talking about reparations and a payment, selling out our suffering for a payment. You should take note from the indigenous people. They're not doing that. They've been offered numerous financial settlements for the theft of the Pahasapa or the Black Hills, or what you call Mount Rushmore. And they have consistently turned down those financial settlement offers. And that's because they have dignity and do never want to sell out the suffering of their ancestors. So you Africans who are talking about sitting down and negotiating with terrorists to get some kind of reparations payment, you need to take a note about that and learn something about dignity. So we honor the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, and we also honor our African ancestors, of course, who, contrary to the lies that are constantly being told, they fought from the moment they faced the colonists. They fought for our liberation. And the way we see it is the fact that we're even here today is because of the fight that they've engaged, the fight that they put up to struggle against our oppression. And we need to understand that and stop with this nonsense about the people who encountered the colonists didn't fight against them. Anybody saying that is just completely ignorant and hasn't studied our history. There's just no other way to say it. You just clearly don't know what you're talking about, so stop talking if you're saying something like that. And start doing some work to study our history, because anybody that does knows that we have always fought. We continue to fight. If you see yourself today as a fighter, then that's because you inherited the spirit of your ancestors. And that spirit started in Africa. It didn't start in the Western Hemisphere. It started in Africa. And like the meme says, if you want to know what you would be doing about injustice against our people 100, 200 years ago, then just look at what you're doing right now. If all you're doing right now is talking about it, then that's what you'd have been doing 100, 200 years ago. So we know our people have always struggled against injustice. So we give them honor and respect for that. And we are just proud to inherit their outstanding legacy, and we look forward to making further contributions to it. And so we'll get started with just some introductions for what we are going to be doing today and who is going to be talking to you. My name is Ajamu again, a longtime organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. I've done work for the party all over the world, Pan-African work, and honored to do that work and continue doing it for as long as I have breath available to function in this plane. And then also with me, I have my outstanding daughter, Sekou, who is working on her PhD and is engaged in a consistent level of activist work around African women's health issues. And so just honored to, have a positive relationship with her and be able to do this work with her every Sunday, and just happy to be able to continue doing this. And getting back to the All African People's Revolutionary Party for just a second, you all, the work that we do, our objective is Pan-Africanism, which we define as one unified socialist Africa, one unified socialist Africa. Kwame Nkrumah, in his legendary book there that you see at the right, The Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, he talks about until Africa is free, no African on earth will be free. And we believe that to the core. And so Pan-Africanism is the solution to that problem wherever African people exist. And we define African people as all Africans, all people of African descent, whether you live in Europe, Africa, whether you live in India, Australia, whether you live in the Western Hemisphere, you're an African. And that objective of one unified socialist Africa, in the handbook there, Nkrumah lays out the strategy for achieving Pan-Africanism or one unified socialist Africa. And he talks about the necessity to unite on the ground the mass revolutionary Pan-African formations throughout Africa who agree with this objective of one unified socialist Africa and who will also agree to work together to achieve it. So in that, we have a number of examples there for you. The Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, or what you call South Africa, the Azanian People's Organization from the same region of our homeland, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau, the party that is in a governing position in Guinea-Bissau today, the Democratic Party of Guinea, which we'll talk about a lot during the presentation today, since that was the party of Sekou Ture in Guinea, the Amilcar Cabral Ideological School, Nigeria, Pan-African movement, the movement for Zimbabwe movement for Pan-African Socialists, in Zimbabwe, Pan-African Union of Sierra Leone, and many other organizations who agree one unified socialist Africa is the objective. And we all work together to form this unified fighting force that Nkrumah talks about in the handbook that you see before you. And then finally, we have chapters all over the world, and we have relationships with all the other liberation movements that are fighting against the same enemy we're fighting against, the international capitalist imperialist network led by the United Snakes of America. And so other movements that are engaging in that fight, the Filipino National Liberation Movement, the Irish Republican Socialist National Liberation Movement, the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, and of course, as we previously mentioned, the movement of the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, all have the same enemies that we do, you all. So of course, it just makes logical sense that we would build relationships with them as well and work with them because their victories are our victories and our victories are their victories. Okay, so again, we thank you very much for joining us today. And to get us started talking about the unknown contributions of Sekou Ture, I will turn it over to Sekou.
Good evening, everyone. I hope that you all are hanging in there and doing as best as you can this evening. I'm so happy to be with you all, and I thank you all again for tuning in as we all try to open our minds up to learn more about not only different people who were instrumental in making our past be what it is and leading to our future, but also being open-minded to understanding that Pan-Africanism is truly not accomplished by just knowing about Africans who were in America doing wonderful things to deconstruct colonialism. that also means understanding and learning about Africans from all over the world, right? And so I think a lot of times when we think about the educational processes that take place here in the United States, it is very easy to separate and to kind of look at things from a tier standpoint, if you will. So in terms of what's priority and what's not. And unfortunately, if you are not born on US soil, you have less value in terms of how you contribute to make the world better, or at least that's what we've been taught to understand, because that perpetuates and promotes the value that capitalism brings in terms of protecting money being made and enhancing America to continue doing terrorist attacks in other countries and other parts of the world. So I'm really excited to be a part of this journey with us today as we all talk about Sekou Ture, because I think it's important that we understand that there were people shaking up the ground every single place and making things better for African people. And a lot of them were not born here on US soil. And I think that that's really, really important, just as we continue to move into learning, but also this year and what it brings for us. You know, like you're never going to stop learning. So why not consider learning about Africans that were born outside of the US who still contributed to make life better for Africans within the United States? That's just my 2 cents, but I really hope that you take this journey with me and allow your brain to grow with me as we talk about Sekou Ture. Sekou Ture was born within the Mandinka Muslim family in the village town of Farina, Guinea on January 9th, 1925. For those Africans today who continue to disrespect our ancestors and our legacy by promoting the lie that our people in Africa didn't fight for us, Ture was the great-grandson of Samori Ture. Many of you may remember the elder Ture from, quote, Great Kings of Africa, end quote, posters, Budweiser. Yes, Budweiser, produced during the 80s and 90s. Samori Ture was a founding member of the fiercely anti-colonial Wassoulou people who strongly resisted French colonialism in 1882 until the French captured Samori Ture in 1898. Sekou Ture inherited the rebellious spirit and actions of his family. As a school-aged child, he was disciplined for leading an anti-colonial walkout. And his activism expanded when he became active, when he founded the Post and Telecommunications Workers Union in Guinea in 1946. That same year, he became a founding member of the African Democratic Party, which was an alliance of political parties in French colonized West Africa. Guinea was then and continues today to be a desired location by international imperialism. Rich in bauxite reserves, Guinea serves as one of the world's most plentiful suppliers of this mineral, which is essential in developing all aluminum produced products from custom wheels to aluminum foil. In 1952, Ture became a leader of the Democratic Party of Guinea, which emerged from the Democratic African Party to become the leading force in Guinea, striving towards independence from the French. And I just want to pay homage and acknowledge that this brother that you see on the slide here is Sekou Ture's great-grandfather. This is his grandfather, Samori, that I spoke about. And so as we just continue to think about that we are our ancestors, pun intended, not only because they are biologically related, but also because of his great-grandfather's choices, that's what fueled Sekou Ture to lead the anti-colonial walkout just when he was a child. I mean, how cool is that? Just when you think about how brave and how organized and sophisticated he had to be to take that on. And what were the causes and effects that made him want to do that? And then when he became a little bit older, he created the Post and Telecommunications Workers Union. Like, that's really cool. And again, these are things that we wouldn't know if we rely on capitalist media to teach us about who we are. That's the danger in doing that, is you can't rely on a system that is not for you to tell you about yourself. And if you do, you have to understand that there's going to be some lies and mistruths along the way, Because if they teach you too much about who you are, then you might actually empower yourself and understand you don't need to be oppressed anymore. And that's a dangerous thing for capitalism. So let's continue to think about that as we think about how remarkable Sekou Ture was in terms of making our lives better everywhere, not just in Africa, not just in America, but all over the world, because he valued us. And a lot of times the work that he's doing is still impacting people to this day. And he hasn't even met all the people who have been impacted by his courageousness and his bravery. And so we should just think about that and give homage to him for that. Next slide, please. And I say give homage to him, but of course we should acknowledge his family and his roots and other things that contribute to make him who he is today. Okay. All right, so the first major historical distinction that must be recognized about Sekou Ture was his leadership within the Democratic Party of Guinea, also known as the PDG, during that country's push for independence from France. During the wave of Africans marching forward, France, in an effort to maintain control over their dependence on cheap African human and material resources, sought to manage African independence by offering all of the French colonies in Africa the so-called opportunity to join the French Union. Senegal, the Ivory Coast, Cameroons, Burkina Faso, then Upper Volta, all jumped at the opportunity. But Sekou Ture led the PDG in refusing to remain under French rule in any form or fashion. The PDG's demand was, quote, independence now, end quote. Guinea achieved its objective on October 2nd, 1958, but not without major consequences for their brave and courageous stance. France left the country and removed every form of infrastructure with them. Plumbing throughout the country was removed. So this is why we need to think about why decolonization is important. And we also have to understand there's going to be consequences when we stand up and do what's right. So because France wasn't able to win over Guinea, they took away their plumbing, y'all, throughout the entire country. Plumbing throughout the country was removed. Electrical wiring removed. Any semblance of infrastructure Guinea would need to build an independent country was stolen from them by France, as if 150 rules of colonial exploitation had not been enough. Undeterred, the PDG began working to build a fiercely independent, proud, and African country that would go on to serve as an example of dignity to African people everywhere. And I just thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much, Brother Sekou Ture. I am truly humbled to explain a little bit of who you are to our ancestors and to the people listening today. And I thank you all for listening.
All right, thank you, Shakura. And again, also, I echo that. I thank you all for being here. And I want to throw a shout out to our brother Muhammad, who is watching us from Somaliland at home in Africa. I hope you are well and your family is well, my brother, and be well. And we know you are always continuing to spread the need for our people to unite wherever you are on earth. And we see you and appreciate you. And this is totally consistent with our discussion about Sekou Ture and just the dignity, the theme of dignity that Sekou Ture was known to articulate and impact upon people for his entire time on earth. And Shakura talked about the dignity that Guinea rose up in the midst of French barbarism against the people of Guinea for just their absolute audacity to stand up on dignity and say that we want to be free now. We don't want you to dictate to us how our freedom should exist. So I think when you think about Sekou Ture, one thing that's important to always keep in mind was his commitment to ensure that our people always represented dignity. And two stories come to mind to illustrate that. First was immediately after Guinea became independent in 1958, Guinea made its first trip to the US to meet with State Department officials here in this country in 1959. And there was a delegation of about a dozen people from the PDG in Guinea who came to this country to meet with US government officials. And the US government, you know, at that time, the late 50s, leading up to the early 1990s, their sole political program was enticing countries to come on the side of Western imperialism against the Eastern Socialist Bloc, as they call it then, the Soviet Union led countries in Eastern Europe, or what they called the Socialist Bloc or the Warsaw Pact. And so the US's entire strategy was to win people over to the NATO side, as they called it, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or just the Western capitalist countries, right? And the divider in that was the Berlin Wall in Germany, which separated then West Germany from East Germany. Of course, that no longer exists today. But the US's entire policy was that, getting countries to make a decision and come on the side of Western imperialism. So when the PDG and Sekou Ture took this first delegation trip to the US in 1959, the only thing the US officials here wanted to talk to them about were aid packages that were designed to win them over to imperialism side. You know, aid pack, we'll give you this aid, take this aid, we'll help you build infrastructure, we'll do all these things. And they just, the US imperialist officials just had the hardest time understanding why the PDG delegation constantly refused the aid. And they just did not understand how to listen when Sekou Ture kept explaining to them through interpreters that we didn't come here for your aid. We came here for respect for ourselves as an independent people in Africa. We came here for respect. We came, whatever relationship we're going to have with you, it has to be based on respect. It can't be based on anything else. And of course, these people, you know, they had no ability to understand that. And they wrote a lot about State Department officials during that time about how anything that they talked to the delegation from Guinea about, the PDG delegation, whether it was where they were, the aid packages, or whether it was just where they were going to have a meal and what they were going to have for the meal, the PDG delegation had to talk about it collectively, because again, they were advancing principles of scientific socialism within the Democratic Party of Guinea, and collective leadership, not just individual leadership, not just individuals making decisions. So, you know, these Western capitalists, like, they just couldn't fathom that. Like, y'all can't even decide what you want to eat without talking about it with each other. Like, they would tell Sekou Ture, well, you're the president, right? And Sekou Ture would tell him, yes, I'm the president, but we are a collective political party. We are a mass party. And so we make decisions collectively. So that was one thing that reinforced this concept of dignity that was so important to Sekou Ture. Another story comes from the lips of our brother El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, or Malcolm X. And, you know, most of you, if all you know about Malcolm X is what you saw in that ridiculous Spike Lee movie, then, you know, you don't really understand any of this stuff that I'm about to talk about. But the reason why Malcolm was assassinated, you all, was because of his work, his Pan-African work, particularly his work in Africa. He didn't really have much of a chance to develop his work here in the US. But one thing he did do was establish an organization that was going to be linked to Pan-African work in Africa. It wasn't called the Organization of Afro-American Unity for nothing. And so when Malcolm X was touring Africa, he met with the most principled Pan-African revolutionaries in Africa. He wrote in his autobiography that the highest honor of his life was meeting and developing a relationship with Kwame Nkrumah, who we talked about as the founder of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. And, you know, that's what Malcolm said in his autobiography. He didn't say the highest honor of my life was meeting the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He said it was Kwame Nkrumah. That's what he said. And his work, he kept a diary of all of his travels and his work. And that diary was in handwritten form, in pages and pages, in boxes, that were held by his daughter, Gamila Shabazz. And Gamila, you know, bless her heart, has struggled with a lot of issues. And so she was actually evicted from the house, I believe in New Jersey, where she had this box in the basement. And the European who owned the house and went through her things that she left behind after she was evicted, this European found all these pages and figured out that this was a diary. This was Malcolm X's diary. And so, of course, he tried to sell it on eBay. And then the other daughters of Malcolm X, Sister Yasala, they were able to successfully sue this Europeans and get the papers back. And Ayatollah Shabazz published the diary of Malcolm X 3 years ago. And in that diary, Malcolm talked about when he was in Guinea as a guest of the Democratic Party of Guinea, he was given a personal guard. He was given a driver. He was given a chef. He was given all of that while he was in Guinea. And I think that's important to mention, because you all have to understand, as I mentioned before, the US was applying pressure to these newly independent African countries like Ghana and Guinea. And so the worst thing these leaders in these countries could have done to antagonize the US was to interact, not only interact, but to provide diplomatic status to the chief people who were opposing US policy and criticizing US policy, people like Malcolm X, not even Martin Luther King, but Malcolm X. So this is what the PDG and Ture did, is they elevated Malcolm to a position of dignitary and diplomatic status. And Malcolm talked about this in his diary, and he talked about how when he was in Guinea, that's all Sekou Ture talked to him about, is about our people need dignity. You have to teach our people to have dignity and to stand up and to not accept these offers to buy them out and to not sell out for pieces of gold and silver, and to stand on the question that our people need freedom and dignity. And Malcolm talked about that extensively in his diary. He wrote about it, and he was highly impacted by this lesson that he learned from Sekou Ture. So those are just two examples to, you know, further illustrate this question of dignity and how important this was to Sekou Ture and the work that he saw himself doing. Another thing to understand was Sekou Ture's concrete contributions to building Pan-Africanism, building one unified socialist Africa. We'll talk about, you know, how he contributed concretely to laying the groundwork that we're still living off of today in 2021. But early on in the 50s and 60s, the work that Sekou Ture did to ensure that that would happen. One of the main things was his invitation to the delegation from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which was one of the leading civil rights organizations here in this country in the 60s. In 1964, a delegation of SNCC went to Guinea. And the people who went on that delegation, people like Miss Fannie Lou Hamer and John Lewis, the congressman who just recently made his physical transition. John Lewis came back fired up, talking about how much the dignity and the confidence and the pride of the people of Guinea had impacted him as a poor boy growing up in Georgia, who was taught that, you know, he didn't have any right to have any dignity, and how much of an impact going to Guinea had on him. And he talked about that extensively and how much it influenced his work in SNCC. And Miss Hamer talked about that as being a poor woman with a third grade education in Mississippi, who had been told her whole life that the best she could ever do was be a sharecropper for the plantation industry in the southern US, and how going to Guinea, how she was treated like a diplomat by the Democratic Party of Guinea, and how she sat at the table with Sekou Ture. And she talked about how good looking Sekou Ture was, how handsome he was, and how much attention he paid to her, and how much that meant to her. You know, as him being a leader of a country, a president of a country, and him spending all the time he spent with her. And I don't think that when she talked about his look, she was just talking about that in a physical sense. She was making the point that it was the first time in her life that she recognized that as an African woman, an African human being, she had as much value as anybody on the planet Earth, and how much the people of Guinea helped her understand that because of how they treated her and how important they made her feel, and gave her a feeling that she never had in all her years in this country, the country where she was born. So that's significant because these experiences by these folks in SNCC and them coming back here and talking about them made a major contribution towards radicalizing SNCC. And that, of course, made a major contribution towards radicalizing the African liberation movement in this country. So it had a tremendous impact on how we moved forward in this country. And so, you know, these idiots running around here talking about, well, the people in Africa, they didn't do nothing to help our movement. These are just idiots who don't know anything about our history and don't understand how the African independence movement so influenced the US civil rights and Black power movements in this country. People just don't have any idea about that. And that's why we're sharing this with you this way, so that we can stop, we can cut this ignorance off and shut it down. Because another concrete example of how Sekou Ture influenced the movements here was the willingness of Sekou Ture and the Democratic Party of Guinea to accept African freedom fighters from this hemisphere who wanted to come home to Africa. And there are a number of examples of that. There's Miss Shirley Graham Du Bois, who was able to come and go and had open access to Guinea for the time that, you know, that she lived, and continuing to do her work that she started in this country, of course, but that continued when she moved to Ghana with her husband, W.E.B. Du Bois. And after he died there and the Central Intelligence Agency overthrew the government of Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah, she, of course, Shirley Graham Du Bois, went to Guinea and was able to continue that work there, going back and forth between Guinea and Egypt, where she lived for the remainder of her life. And also the willingness of Sekou Ture to accept the young Stokely Carmichael as a resident of Guinea. In 1968, young Stokely Carmichael went to Guinea and met Sekou Ture and met Kwame Nkrumah, who was then living in Guinea, which we'll talk about more in a second. But the young Stokely Carmichael ended up accepting the advice and the counsel of Sekou Ture and became a mentee of Sekou Ture and Kwame Nkrumah, and joined the Democratic Party of Guinea after previously being, you know, the chairperson of SNCC here in this country and being the prime minister of the Black Panther Party. Went to Guinea and spent the last 30 years of his life as a working militant within the Democratic Party of Guinea, eventually becoming the leader of the youth organization in the PDG in Guinea, and a member of the Central Committee of Guinea, as well as a member of the Central Committee of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, thus, for, you know, working to fulfill what Kwame Nkrumah had written in the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare about all these Pan-African formations uniting on the ground. So the contribution of Sekou Ture towards African people in the West is on question in terms of this lesson of dignity and continuing to bestow upon us the understanding that we're a part of a worldwide African community that is based in Africa, and we have to unite to win back our freedom and our forward progress. Then, you know, also, this is not talked about much at all, but the work that the Democratic Party of Guinea in general, and Sekou Ture in particular, did in terms of developing what Pan-African cadre looked like in political parties, in socialist parties in Africa. Like, what is the process to develop Pan-African cadre on the ground? And Sekou Ture talked a lot about that in Strategy and Tactics of the African Revolution. If you can find that book, you should definitely have it. Strategy and Tactics of the African Revolution. It's all writings by Sekou Ture. And he talks about the techniques that the PDG employed in Guinea to develop its cadre membership, to develop its mass membership into people who could contribute towards the emancipation of African people in Guinea and all over Africa and all over the African world. And he talked about the tools that they used in the PDG to do that, such as democratic centralism, which is a democratic decision-making process, and criticism, self-criticism, which the PDG used extensively, and consensus decision-making, which was something else that SNCC was heavily influenced by. Democratic centralism and consensus decision-making. It's two different forms depending upon, what the decision is and the conditions, but things that the PDG practiced on a regular basis and instilled within their cadre, in their development. And then also Sekou Toure's invaluable contributions on an ideological level. Like we in the All African People's Revolutionary Party, we recognize that culture, the ideology comes from a people's culture. So, our perspective is we respect like different revolutionary ideologies like Marxist-Leninism, which, evolves from the ideas of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, among others. But we argue that as African people, those are not the ideologies that can direct our forward movement towards emancipation. We have different cultural realities. Like Marxist-Leninism is an atheist ideology, for example. And, African people there are certainly African people who are atheists, but atheism is never been and never will be something that is dominant among African people. It certainly is among European people because none of the major religions, if you trace them, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, none of them had strong foundations in Europe. None of them started in Europe. None of them had strong existences in Europe. So it's easy to understand, if you understand that, how atheism could take hold in Europe the way it does. But in Africa, it's different. All of those three major religions had major developments in Africa. If they didn't start themselves in Africa, Judaism certainly initiated itself in Africa. Christianity certainly initiated itself in Africa. And Islam didn't initiate itself in Africa, but it certainly would have never developed had not the Prophet Muhammad spent his formative years in Africa escaping the infidels who would have certainly assassinated him, which would have had a major impact on Islam's ability to develop. So Africa, and then traditional African forms of worship, Ife, Ibu, and all of the different traditional Verdun forms of African spiritual worship. These are very important to African people. Even African Christians here in the United States, my grandmother used to practice all different types of forms of Verdun. She didn't know it, and I didn't know it, but now I know it because I know what it is. And so spirituality, this kind of thing is important for us. So atheism is not something that's ever going to be a dominant thing among African people. And even though we're scientific socialists within the APRP, we don't see a contradiction between spirituality and revolution. So we're not Marxist-Leninists. We're Nkrumah's Toureists. That's what we call it. And so Sekou Toure's contributions to our Nkrumah's Toureist ideology are invaluable, you all. His analysis of the people's class and anti-people's class, which you can find in that Strategies and Tactics of the African Revolution, that book that I talked about, if you can find it. He talks about the people's class and anti-people's class. And for me, this was just an unbelievable moment of clarity for me when I read this, probably for like the 6th or 7th time, and really began to understand it. Because up until that point, the basic blueprint for class analysis comes from the Marxist analysis. The ruling class, the bourgeoisie class, the petty bourgeoisie class, the working class, or the proletariat, as Marx calls it, and lumpen proletariat, or the criminal class. And so that I understood and it made sense, but it left out the peasantry, because Europe doesn't have a large peasantry. Africa has almost 400 million peasants, and peasants exist for the most part throughout the rest of the world. But Marx didn't talk about peasants because he was coming from his European experience, which we're not mad at him for that, but that's irrefutable. So it didn't include that. And so Sekou Toure's analysis was essential, and Kwame Nkrumah's analysis, because they talked about the three elements that create revolution: the working class, and they talked about the three elements that do that, and they talked about within that element of the working class, the peasantry, and then the African intelligentsia. Sekou Ture talked about the people's class and the anti-people's class. And the way he talked about it, the reason why it provided so much clarity for me is that he talked about the necessity of ideology and understanding the role that ideology plays in class aspirations people have. So in other words, all of you know people who, they might be poor as the dirt, but they see themselves and they aspire to be a part of the capitalist class. Like, I'll never forget when Mandela was released from prison, we were passing out posters that had Gaddafi and Mandela on them to illustrate the unity of Africa, North and South. And I was in Berkeley doing this, and I was talking to a houseless man, a man who was living on the streets. And he was talking to me about how Gaddafi was a brutal dictator. He didn't know anything about Libya, but he was, he got the propaganda that we all get. And so he was parroting that. And I was telling him, like, you don't even have a place to live. Like, why are you defending this system? Because that's what he's doing. He was talking about how America's the freest country in the world. And this is an example of what Sekou Ture talked about with the people's class and anti-people's class. Because even though the Marx definition is that your class is defined strictly in a determinist way based on your relationship to the means of production, what Ture contributed to that is the analysis that, no, it's not just your material relation to the means of production, it's also your ideas, what you're pursuing. So this houseless man, even though his material connection to the means of production are through the working class, because he doesn't even have a place to live, and he's surviving on programs that are financed by working people, his ideological foundation is in line with the petty bourgeoisie, because this guy's telling me, like, he would defend anybody that came here to attack the, and I'm like, what are you defending? You don't even have a place to live. But that's the ideology that he had. So, Sekou Ture talks about understanding what it means when people are a part of the anti-people's class, where they make the conscious decision to work against the interests of the people, regardless of what their material class conditions are. So that's a critical contribution to people who want to understand progressive movements, people's class, anti-people's class. And then his analysis on class struggle was outstanding. I mean, that's where I learned that, from Sekou Ture. His analysis of how the world evolved from communalism through slavery, through feudalism, through the development of capitalism based on the transatlantic slave trade, and how it'll continue to move. Like, the way we're taught is that capitalism has always been here, and it'll always be here, and there never can be anything else. But if you study history, clearly that's not true. This is just the period that capitalism is dominant. Like all those other systems I just named had their periods where they were dominant, and capitalism's period will come to an end. And we're in the stages of the ending of the capitalist period. Capitalism is in a severe state of decline right now. This is why you're having all the problems you're having in the world. And the next stage that we predict is socialism becoming the dominant stage. And when socialism becomes dominant in the world, that's when you have the conditions where communism can exist. You can't have communism until socialism is overwhelmingly dominant. And anybody that doesn't understand that, that's why you're confused about what socialism and communism is. And you listen to people who are telling, well, communism has failed. Well, it can't have failed because it's never happened yet, because the world has never been dominantly socialist. This analysis was made so clear to me through Sekou Toure's analysis of class struggle, which is, again, you can find that in Strategy and Tactics, of the African Revolution. So we highly recommend that. And his analysis on anti-patriarchy through his piece on women in society. You know, of course, we can build so much on that and we can make it so much better. But for him to be writing about this in the early 60s and how you have to create a culture where the oppression of women identifying people is dominant in the work that you're doing, not just looking at progress as individual people in individual positions. Many of us are so confused on that. We think we let the capitalist system teach us to evaluate progress based on individual positions. So you have Barack Obama as president, so that means we're progressing collectively. You have Kamala Harris as vice president, so that in your eyes means that we're progressing collectively. No, that's one individual person in a position, while the masses of our people have not only not moved forward, but have moved backwards. So that's why that analysis is so important, of understanding the need to change the culture, the material conditions when doing work around anti-patriarchy, like Ture talked about in his Women in Society piece that you see in the bottom picture there. And then finally, his analysis on negritude. Negritude, I know people probably just never heard that word, but this concept of Afrocentricity, and what I would argue are a lot of the backward anti-class analysis concepts that have evolved from these backward concepts. Now we're talking about people who are talking, you know, that we were indigenous to the Western Hemisphere. All of this stuff is sick, underdeveloped ideas that evolved from a lack of a class analysis, a lack of a nation, class, gender analysis, an unscientific viewpoint of the world. And so in Negritude, Sekou Ture talks extensively about the race construct. And he talks about us being African because of our connection to Africa. And it's not just we're African descent, it's that we're African ascent. We're African ascent because our connection to Africa is about what Africa is going to mean for us in our future as a land base that supplies most of the world's needed resources. It doesn't have anything to do with us coming from there hundreds of years ago. And that was a groundbreaking analysis for me when I read it for the first time when I was in my 20s. It helped me understand what African nationalism was about, and it helped me evolve beyond just the race understanding of it. And now I understand it. Like, I don't have anything in common with you because we're the same color, because that tells me nothing about what you're trying to do and what you're trying to work for. I don't have nothing in common with you just because we look the same. You could be the enemy. I don't have nothing in common with Barack Obama. He represents the interests that are opposed to humanity. And there's no question about it. Anybody that disputes that, you just don't know what's going on in the world. I'm sorry, you just don't know. And you just need to sit down and do some study and come back and we can have the conversation. Okay, so we're not talking about symbolism. We're not talking about what makes you feel good. We're talking about the impact on the world. You know, you're deporting millions of people. You're bombing hundreds of thousands of people. All you see is Michelle Obama holding the sign, "Bring our children home," and you don't know nothing about her husband bombing and killing hundreds of thousands of our children. That's a fact, you all. You can't deny reality. So you don't know that. So you think that because he looks like us and he's in this position that that's benefiting us. And Sekou Ture destroyed that backward analysis when he talked about negritude. So you should look at that. Revolution, Pan-Africanism, and culture. He talks about negritude. Outstanding contributions to the ideological foundation of the African Revolution today, coming from this man, Sekou Ture. And in terms of looking at how Sekou Ture contributed to Pan-Africanism in Africa, you know, the ability of Guinea to unite with Ghana and Mali, with Kwame Nkrumah and Mobito Keïto, and form this union, which you see illustrated in the picture up there, and to create what was then called the Casablanca Group, was the foundation of creating radical, revolutionary, scientific, socialist-based Pan-Africanism in Africa. And we have to say that because now people say, well, I'm Pan-Africanist, and everybody doesn't mean the same thing when they say that. You all, some people, when they say they're Pan-Africanist, they just mean they want to make some money. Just like when people say they want reparations, they just mean they want some money. They really don't care about the masses of African people or humanity. That's not what they're trying to do anything about. So that's why we say revolutionary Pan-Africanists. And Sekou Ture was a critical part with that. And if you study the conflict in the Congo, for example, you know, Sekou Ture was like the younger brother to Kwame Nkrumah. And he was the radical younger brother to Kwame Nkrumah. And Nkrumah wanted to believe in the structures of the United Nations. He wanted to believe in the Organization of African Unity, which is the African Union now, that he himself founded. And so he wanted to believe in these structures. And Sekou Ture would argue with him and say, this can't work. And when the crisis in the Congo happened, where they sabotaged, the CIA sabotaged the National Congolese movement, along with the French, Belgium imperialism and US imperialism, Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Ture had committed their troops to the United Nations forces that were in the Congo. And Sekou Ture wanted to take the Guinean troops out of that and provide them to Patrice Lumumba. And Kwame Nkrumah, you know, well-intentioned man. I mean, it's easy to have hindsight 2020 and look back on it now. And Nkrumah, when he wrote the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, he acknowledged that. So we don't need people to, oh, well, Kwame Nkrumah was wrong. No, that's we don't need that. We understand what happened historically. But Sekou Ture, I'm just making the point, was the militant one who wanted to send troops into the Congo to fight the CIA and fight Mobutu and all of these forces that were working on behalf of imperialism. And so he, you know, he made a tremendous, that continued on with the militancy that the Democratic Party of Guinea and Sekou Ture displayed when they refused to become a part of the French Union, to how they wanted to participate in the Congo, to how they continued to engage in revolutionary practices in Africa. And after the CIA overthrew Nkrumah's government in Ghana in February 24th, 1966, you know, this is actually the day it happened, today, in 1966. Sekou Ture did not hesitate to invite Kwame Nkrumah to Guinea. And Sekou Ture told him, you are now the president of Guinea, since they illegally overthrew you in Ghana. And Kwame Nkrumah, because of the language barrier of French and English, didn't understand what Sekou Ture was saying. And when it was interpreted to him and the people were cheering, thousands of people were cheering, he communicated that he could not become president of Guinea because the people had elected Sekou Ture. So Sekou Ture said, well, then we'll make you co-president. And so Kwame Nkrumah became co-president of Guinea from that time forward until his physical transition in 1972. And to this day, Kwame Nkrumah, because of that heroic and selfless action by Sekou Ture, what president of any country has wanted to give up his presidency? Because of that, Nkrumah is the only person in human history to be president of two different countries. And not only that, but Ture, because of the overthrow of Nkrumah's government in Ghana, Africa then needed another base for African liberation movement. So Ture immediately made Guinea that base. And so liberation movements began to come to Guinea. Even though Guinea is a very poor country, they began to come there and to receive training and to receive equipment so that they can wage their struggle. Amilcar Cabral came there from Guinea-Bissau and was able to develop stability for the African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau in Guinea. And this is the reason that Portugal, who the African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau, or the PAIGC, was fighting for independence against Portugal. This is why Portugal invaded Guinea in November of 1970. And the people of Guinea fought and defeated Portugal and ran Portugal out of Guinea, because the objectives of Portugal in doing that were multi-form. They wanted to assassinate Amilcar Cabral. They were not able to do that. They were able to successfully do it 3 years after that. But they wanted to destroy the PAIGC, which they were not able to do. The PAIGC eventually ran them out of Guinea-Bissau, and also helped the MPLA do it in Angola, and Frelimo do it in Mozambique. And they also wanted to assassinate Sekou Ture and Kwame Nkrumah, and they bombed the places that they thought that they lived in order to do that. So that's important to know. And then also, like I mentioned, allowing Kwame Ture, who was Stokely Carmichael then, to come to Guinea and develop the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. If it were not for Guinea and the Democratic Party of Guinea, it would be hard to say whether our party would have been able to develop the base in Africa and the work that we've been able to do in Africa, because it was Guinea that gave us the base that allowed Kwame Ture, who was then Stokely Carmichael, to do that and to build upon all the work that we have going on today. So we can do nothing except thank the Democratic Party of Guinea and Sekou Ture for making that humble contribution to African people everywhere by allowing Guinea to be that base. And then, you know, again, if you look at the 6th Pan-African Congress, Sekou Ture made everybody mad because he talked about being an African means that you have to be anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist. He expanded on his negritude analysis that I mentioned before. He talked about that, and all these race nationalists, all these quote unquote so-called Black nationalists who were at this conference, a lot of them from here, people like Maulana Karenga, who founded Kwanzaa, a lot of them from here, they had such a problem. And I'm just, you can look at it. I'm not criticizing them. I'm just telling you the history. They had such a problem with what Sekou Ture said at that Congress because he told them that they are in the interest of imperialism, even though they're in blackface. That's what he told them, and they got mad at that, but that is absolutely correct. And I say it here today, like, you can't be African for just the days of Kwanzaa. You can't put on African clothes for just those days, or those 6 days of Kwanzaa, 7 days of Kwanzaa, and then after that, you go back to working in the capitalist system, trying to advance the capitalist system. That's treason against our people. And that's exactly what Sekou Ture was talking about at that Pan-African Congress in 1974. 50 years ago, he was absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. And even though we didn't want to hear it then, we don't want to hear it now, you can't refute it. So I could talk about Sekou Ture all day. I don't normally have this problem of running out of time, but gonna have to rush because just excited to talk about a real African revolutionary, as Bob Marley said. We will know who the real revolutionaries are. Well, this was one of them, you all. So just to talk quickly about the efforts of imperialism to discredit Sekou Ture. Their claim that he was a dictator. They always say that. And you hear a lot of us say that. Well, Fidel Castro, he is a dictator. But what you don't got to learn how to do is have tools of analysis to evaluate what determines what a dictator is. So what is a dictator? It's someone who steals the resources of a country for themselves, right? Like Mobutu in the Congo, no question a dictator. Kagame in Rwanda, I would say no question a dictator. All of these people are, they no matter what they say, because a lot of you are confused because of the statements they make, but you don't understand what they're actually doing. Museveni in Uganda, I would say no question dictator, even though he says all the right things, he says all the Pan-African things. Julius Malema in Azania says all the right things, but y'all don't look at what these people are doing. So it's not about what someone says, it's what they're doing. And so when they own and control all the resources of the country, that's dictator stuff. And Sekou Ture was someone who died with no resource. There were no Swiss bank accounts, none of that. So how is it benefit? If you're going to call someone a dictator, how are they benefiting by being in the position they're in? Because, you know, Imelda Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos, the former dictator in the Philippines, she had thousands of pairs of shoes, right? Thousands, because they stole all the country's wealth. You can't say that about Fidel Castro or Muammar Gaddafi or Kwame Nkrumah or Sekou Ture. They didn't do any of those things. So no question, not a dictator, a political leader. And then the allegations about Camp Borio. Camp Borio was a camp that they had in Guinea and Conakry. And the purpose of the camp was to send traders. And we don't have time to get deep into it. But all I'll say about Camp Borio, because the imperialists use that, well, he tortured people, Camp Borio. Well, certainly we have a lot of work to do in terms of improving our ability to deal with opposition in our political movements. Like what we do right now, as soon as we determine someone to be the opposition, then they become the enemy. And that's a weakness that we have to work on. But that being said, you can't, whoever was in Camp Borio during Sekou Toure's 26 years as president of Guinea, it's nothing compared to the number of people who were tortured and killed in Camp Borio from 1984 to the present day under the neo-colonial dictators that imperialism installed in Guinea after Sekou Ture. And if you're gonna call Sekou Ture a dictator, then you have to be able to explain how he was in power 26 years when imperialism, US imperialism, French imperialism, British imperialism hated him and did everything to assassinate and destroy him. The only way he could be in power that long is he had to have had the clear and unquestionable support of the masses of people in Guinea. No question about that. And after the PDG was overthrown in 1984, since that time, Lassana Conté and the neo-colonialist puppet who's in power there now, they have mass uprising strikes. They can't do anything. They got all the support of imperialism and they can't do anything to maintain stability. So that destroyed your argument about Camp Borio and Sekou Ture being a dictator. And then the contradictions, within the PDG after Toure's death and how the PDG was immediately overthrown. These are questions that speak to political education, which we always talk about. The lack of the political education of the cadre in the PDG. And it's a struggle that we wage with our comrades in the PDG today. That's our struggle, is that we have to do that. We have to study what Ture talked about. It's good stuff. And we have to implement it in our daily lives. So that's a weakness. And when we lose, it's because we have not recognized the importance of that. So the legacy of Sekou Ture today is that he has given us so many tools to work with to instill strong values in us in terms of how to pursue the African Revolution. So we have a responsibility to do it. In the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, like I said, our ideology is criminism, Tureism. We study his works, Africa on the Move, Strategy and Tactics of the African Revolution, Dialectical Approach to Culture, Pan-Africanism, Revolution and Culture, Women in Society. And we encourage you not to do that just reading it individually, that's great, but to do it the way we do it in an organized political education process. So we encourage you to join the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, and you can do that by going to the site here, aprp-intl.org. You can get more information there as well. I have a blog that I write on and have all these videos are on there if you want to refer them to people, abetterworld.me, so you can do that there. And hoodcommunist.org is a collection of wonderful African revolutionaries from various organizations. You should be reading that. I'm proud to be one of the humble editors, newly appointed editors there. So we're working hard to bring you the truth, you all. And so check out those sites, support independent, revolutionary Pan-African literature, you all, and analysis. It's critical. And then next week, join us on Sunday, January 31st. We're going to be talking about why Hollywood will never correctly tell our history. Hollywood will never correctly tell our history. We're going to be talking about why that is. Same time, same Pan-African channel. And we just want to say sorry for running over a little bit, but we just get so excited about our comrade, Uncle Sekou Ture. And we love you all. We appreciate you joining us here today. Come back next week, let people know. Join an organization working for justice, forward ever, backwards never. And please enjoy the rest of your Sunday.